Welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma Sahar, and with me is Professor Pant from the Observer Research Foundation. You're watching Ideas Factory. Like every week, we're going to discuss the major happenings around the world. And this week, what really occupies our mind is still the US election. President Donald Trump is pushing to return to normal despite being in the active phase of the virus. And he's even backed out of the second round of presidential debate, which was supposed to take place virtually. He says this is no debate if it happens virtually. So all that is there. The vice presidential debate has taken place. But more importantly, what's happening in India's neighborhood, there has been a meeting of the foreign ministers of Quad, and we will look and analyze that as well. What impact does it have? On the US elections, or also how has China reacted to this meeting? All of that on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Welcome, Harsh, to this a new episode of the Ideas Factory, and we would like your views first on what's happening in America. We've seen a very defiant President Trump coming out of the hospital, coming out of the military hospital, and showing to the world that everything is normal. You should not be afraid of COVID. If you are afraid, you are a coward. So he's very, he's trying very hard to pretend that everything is normal, though doctors have said that he's still in the active phase. He's even backed out of the presidential debate, which was supposed to take place virtually, saying that he will not participate if it is virtual. So his effort of showing that everything is normal and is all out again on the campaign trail. The discussions that are around this, the way it's affecting the American election, how do you analyze all that happening?
Naghma, it's surreal. Surreal is the word that comes to your mind, because clearly these elections have a soap opera feeling to them. It just keeps giving. There's not a single week goes by where something or the other does not happen, where you actually don't know how that particular event, how that particular episode would end up, shaping the end result. And there are so many imponderables, so many unknowns, and some known unknowns that continue to create these extraordinary moments in these elections. So I must say that it's very difficult at this point to analyze Mr. Trump. Of course, he has always been beyond analysis, but what he seems to be doing now is even beyond your basic sense of what a politician under these circumstances should be doing. But clearly, he has his own metric of evaluating his own actions, and he feels that by making a case to his supporters that he has been this extraordinary politician who entered the world of coronavirus and came out unscathed, is a message that perhaps he wants to give out to his core supporters, that it's not only there is nothing to worry, but he is a leader who can demonstrate strength in adversity. And perhaps that's a message he wants his supporters, he wants to resonate among his supporters, and also those who are even at this stage undecided. Now, I think the challenge, of course, is that if the opinion polls tell you anything at the moment, it's that Mr. Biden's lead nationally, of course, is widening, but also in the battleground states, Mr. Biden seems to be gaining. And therefore, for Mr. Trump, there is actually no other option but to go on the offensive. So for him to not to capitalize on the present moment, would be quite unpolitical, and therefore for his statements, his actions, and the idea that he wants to demonstrate to the American electorate that he's in command, I think that's very important. I don't know, and I don't think that will have as great an impact on the undecided voters. But I think that's not where he wants to go. He wants, at the end of the day, what these elections are coming down to is mobilization of the base. And if Mr. Trump can get more and more of his base out on the day of elections and vote for him, I think that he thinks would deliver him across the finish line. And perhaps he's right. We don't know at this point, because there has been a palpable lack of enthusiasm even for Mr. Biden. And if we talk of the vice presidential debates as well, we did not see a knockout punch. I mean, there were the two politicians, of course, from very different backgrounds, but clearly no one could deliver, a knockout punch that would have changed the course of these elections. So we are where we were last week at this point.
Absolutely, and vice presidential debate was uh, the buzz was about the buzz that the fly caused in the debate. The vice presidential debate too. There's nothing, as you said, there was nothing very, very significant that people discussed except that. So the US election is really full of drama. And like you said, every week is a soap opera. But if you look at the meeting happening here, the foreign ministers meeting of the Quad countries, um, this is very significant. It's happening at a time also when Japan has seen a change in leadership, and we have the foreign ministers meeting here at a time when China's aggressiveness has increased with its neighbors. It's in a military confrontation with India. There's possible occupation of Hong Kong. So when you look at all this, the question arises that do we see a bigger role, a more significant role for a Quad in this area? Can it become an Asian NATO?
I think there will be, there is still some time before we can talk of a more structured Quad. But what perhaps if you see the indications, the indications are that the four nations involved in this engagement, the US, Japan, Australia, and India, are more and more willing to engage as a group. And I think that has been a problem in the past. 2007, when Quad was initially talked about, there was a problem, and both Australia and India decided not to go down that route. I think from 2007 to 2017, there has been a resurrection in 2017. And since 2017, if you look at the trajectory of Quad from 2017 to 2020, we have seen more and more engagement, more and more, coming together of these four countries at various levels. Of course, this was the second foreign ministerial level meeting, but domain level meetings have happened, bilateral, trilaterals have happened, and foreign ministry level meetings have happened. So at multiple levels, we have seen that engagement growing. And that engagement has grown, as you were rightly pointing out, in consonance with the dramatic escalation of multiple conflicts around China's periphery, with some of these with the countries involved here, in particular when it comes to India, Australia, and we have seen a hardening of Trump administration stance also vis-a-vis China. So I think all of these factors have led to this consolidation of Quad in some ways. Now, what tends to happen is that, at times there is a sense that, Quad does not really have a big agenda, or there's no clear agenda about Quad. At the same time, there is this belief that, it might be a precursor to China's containment. Now, clearly, China is a very important part of why these countries are coming together. But I think in terms of the agenda evolution, we are at an initial stage, but that initial stage gives you a very clear sense that the four countries are increasingly convergent on the wider strategic issues of the day. And in particular, what is happening in the Indo-Pacific, this idea of free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, is something that is going to drive the agenda of the Quad, and is already driving the agenda of the Quad at the moment. So I think this is going to be a very, very important platform and institutional framework. It may not evolve immediately to the level of a more formalized NATO-like structure, but I think we are already witnessing something very interesting happening in the Indo-Pacific strategic landscape.
And what significant things would you like to point out about the meeting especially between India and Japan, the agreements that we've had on 5G, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence? So there's a bigger thing about the Quad, but also India, Japan. How do you see this relationship blossoming?
Well, what is interesting, if you look at Quad, there might be some critics who would say, look, as I was pointing out, that agenda is not ambitious enough, that beyond talks, nothing of substance is happening. But if you look at the bilaterals and trilaterals within the Quad, they are moving at a quite rapid pace, and that is very, very interesting because as you underscoring the India-Japan dynamic. Of course, it has been growing. It has grown significantly, particularly under the leadership of Shinzo Abe. And there were concerns that beyond Mr. Abe, perhaps it may not last. But we are seeing that Suga administration is equally enthusiastic about Japan's priorities in the Indo-Pacific, but also enthusiastic about India. And this particular meeting sets the stage for something potentially very, very important, which is the emerging technologies and how Japan and India are coming together, or perhaps would like to come together to shape that architecture of emerging technologies. And that geopolitics of technology that is going to be very, very critical for the balance of power in the coming years is driving Indo-Japan relations at the moment. So if you look at what they were talking about when they said cybersecurity, cybersecurity looks very basic. But if you look at it in the context of COVID-19, post COVID-19, you would have countries, individuals, societies more and more dependent on digital technology. And if the digital technology is going to be the basis of economic renaissance coming up over the next few decades, then clearly countries like China, India, and Japan would like to be secure enough so that they can take their economic, develop their economic potential to the fullest. And I think that's where the criticality of this agreement lies, that it is not simply about cyber security in a generic sense. It is about how these two very important Asian countries are looking outside, in particular to countries like China that are using cyber as a medium for asymmetric leverage. And they are shaping their domestic political priorities, domestic economic priorities, by making a case to each other that they need to work together in developing not only cyber technologies, but also other critical technologies as the decades and years come by. So I think this is one area which I think is very, very significant, and therefore the agreement should not be underestimated. Which brings us to the second argument, which you pointed out. 5G, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things were mentioned, and I think that's again points to the emerging strategic technology landscape, where the two nations, both Delhi and Tokyo, remain very keen to engage with each other, to use each other's synergies, to leverage each other's synergies. And I think that's going to be one area where perhaps there is a lot of potential that is yet to be realized. We have had a lot of discussion between India and Japan on the larger strategic realities, on the Indo-Pacific, on maritime security. But on emerging strategic technologies, I think this is the first time that we are looking at a consolidation of a relationship that has so much potential. And given that in their own ways, both India and Japan are at the cutting edge of these technologies and are reliant on these technologies going forward, or going to be reliant on these technologies, it sends out a very important message to various stakeholders, including to China, that countries are now willing to come together, to work together, to develop alternative mechanisms of technologies, and to protect themselves if countries like China remain adamant in abusing the cyber domain to their advantage. And I think that's a very important message that has gone out of this India-Japan engagement this week.
Absolutely. And when the four ministers met, Harsh, at the ministerial meeting in Tokyo on Tuesday, none of the ministers really named China except for US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And we know that China was not really discussed openly by others, but we know that China was at the heart of the meeting. And as we have discussed that there is a fear, or there is a question that can Quad grow into a force that China fears. Now, when Mike Pompeo mentioned China and spoke about it, when other ministers also expressed concern about China maintaining a rule-based order, China has also reiterated and has slammed the Chinese state media, has particularly been very critical of Mike Pompeo, and have highlighted the fact that they do not appreciate these very exclusive and organizing these closed cliques, like these were the words used by the Chinese state media. So China has made very apparent their displeasure. But Mike Pompeo did name China, whereas the others did not. So we see that China is at the heart of this, and the alliance is basically to contain China. So let's just look at this dynamic here.
Yes, there is, Nagma, it's very interesting because there seems to be an inherent contradiction in Chinese response. At times you see a derision for Quad likes, for Quad, for example. They say, oh, it's never going to work. It's irrelevant. These countries are, trying something which is never going to work. At the same time, every time Quad is mentioned anywhere, Chinese go ballistic. They come out with a statement. Official statements come out and the Chinese media goes ballistic. And I think that's where the problem in some ways lies, and that's where the utility of Quad also perhaps lies. In that sense, it rattles China in ways that you can comprehend because in a way, because China is very sensitive, or Chinese policymakers have traditionally been very sensitive to the changing balance of power in the region. And for Quad, the most important message is that here are these four countries that are willing to engage with each other in a manner to preserve the balance of power in their favor. So China's hegemony will be resisted, and that resistance by these four major powers would give fuel to the smaller nations, because then they will find alternatives. There is an alternative they would realize to Chinese, to being dominated by China. And I think that's where the real worry for China lies, that if the message goes out that there are alternatives to China, economically, militarily, strategically, politically, diplomatically, that creates a tension in Chinese foreign policy and foreign policy outreach. And so every time you have these meetings, you hear these contradictory kind of statements. On the one hand, they would deride Quad. On the other, they would say, oh, it's, you are trying to do something. You're trying to create these exclusive cliques, which are not necessary or which are not needed. This is a attempt to contain China, etc., etc. So I think clearly for Chinese policymakers, Quad is a problem. It presents a problem. Or whatever its media, its official statements might indicate.
Yes. But also, can you explain it for us? When we talk of the foreign ministers of the Quad countries, none of the other foreign ministers really mentioned China explicitly, but Mike Pompeo did, and Mike Pompeo very clearly expressed concerns about talking about the threat of China in the region, and saying that it is very, very important to protect these countries from China's aggression. And he says it's more critical now than ever that we collaborate to protect our people and partners from the Chinese Communist Party's exploitation, corruption, and coercion. We've seen in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Mekong, the Himalayas, the Taiwan Strait. So he's given these examples, whereas the others do not explicitly talk about China. So it shows the eagerness that the US has to contain China in this region with the help of the other countries. So the difference in approach that the other countries are taking and what the US is projecting, can you just explain that for us?
Yes, I think, for the US, clearly the engagement with China, the underlying strategic competition with China is at the heart of its strategic outreach. And therefore, US is more explicit. It has always been more explicit about the challenge China poses. The problem for other nations in the region remains that they live in a region where China is such a big player. So clearly, even when you are having a conflict across the border, India is continuing its diplomatic engagement with China. So you have to be careful in terms of how you articulate the problem that China poses. But if you read the statements from all the three, Japan, India, and Australia, they in their own ways are framing this conversation not simply as a problem that China poses physically or materially, but also in terms of values. So for example, Indian foreign minister talked about respect for territorial sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national sovereignty. Now, clearly the challenge, the one country that is at the moment challenging India in terms of sovereignty is China. So the target was very clear. But the way it was articulated was that this is a matter of principle. This is a matter of state behavior. On what principles should state behavior last? On what principles should states conduct their behavior? That is the fundamental question for India, for a lot of other countries. Similarly, for Australia, it became a question of individual rights, human rights, and how you frame that, how Australians are framing that about political interference in in countries by China. So when you look at where various countries are coming from, they are coming from from different vantage points when they look at the China problem. For America, the China problem is a structural problem. It's a problem that is manifesting itself across the board, and it's a global competition that is increasingly evident. And Indo-Pacific is becoming the center of gravity of that competition. For other countries, it is a bilateral problem which needs to be tackled bilaterally as well as through the use of various other forums like the Quad. So therefore, the approaches are going to be different. The articulation is going to be different. But I think no country, especially these four countries, are not leaving anyone in doubt that even as they convey or conduct their diplomatic outreach with China, the principles on which that diplomatic outreach would be conducted, uh, those will be defined not by China, but by countries that value a certain transparency, a certain rule of law, a certain interpretation of the global order that perhaps China does not share.
Absolutely, and that's why recent statement by the United States NSA has also said the time has come to accept that talks won't make China change its aggressive stance. There's an increased recognition of China's aggression, and that's how the rest of the countries, keeping this in mind, are forming alliances. We have time for this much on this episode of Ideas Factory. We'll see you again next week. Thank you so much, Harsh.